So I'd like to thank BC TEAL, first and foremost, for inviting me to come do a talk. I've been planning to come to BC TEAL for quite some time, and finally when they invited me to do a plenary and a 3-hour workshop and a tchotchke, I jumped at the chance to do it, because actually this is my first time in Vancouver, and I very much enjoy it so far, so I'm very, very happy to be here. Now, I want to talk to you today about something that's quite passionate in my own existence. And the first, however, thing I want to say is that this was not the original title of this talk. And so I had a slightly more provocative title that I'm going to go into now. And after that, I'm kind of going to stay over here for a couple of minutes because I have a video to play. But after that, we'll move into the center. So, I had another version of this talk, or at least this title, that I tested out on a group of people last week. And one thing is that the talk is not a talk that's attacking publishers, although I'm going to be talking about publishers a little bit. The talk is not a talk that is meant to create an LGBTQ curriculum for LGBTQ only students. So that's not what this talk is either. And finally, this talk was originally called "This Talk Will Make You Gay." However, because I tested it out in a group last week, they didn't actually come out gay, so it didn't really deliver on the promise. And so what I think we can glean from this is that being exposed to LGBTQ narratives within materials does not make somebody gay. And so I think parents, we don't have to worry about those types of things happening to our children if that is such a worry, because the talk did not deliver in that way anyway. Now, the last thing I'll say just before I jump in is that I was happy to see that in this program there are 4 or 5 talks that are about LGBTQ narratives. Now, of course, 3 of them are by the same 2 people, I've noticed. And one of them is coming up later this afternoon. So as a follow-up to my plenary, you might want to attend Rowan and Kate's session this afternoon. Now, I've got one little task that I want everyone to do. So this is the only time I'm going to ask you to do any kind of pair work, because I personally hate that myself. However, you know, we're teachers and we have to do things that we ask our students to do. So I'm going to show you 2 quick videos. And for both videos, I have these 2 questions first. Okay, so I want you to think about, as you're watching the video, what activity are the people doing in the video, and what is the purpose of the video? It should be pretty easy, I think, for most of us to glean the answers to that. However, I've got a third question, and I want you to think about this as well. So 3A is how do you feel about the people in the video, and how do they surprise you? Okay, so I'm going to say that this third of the auditorium is going to try to focus on that third question as well. Okay? The second question, or the second version of question number 3, is what did the people do in the past that they don't do now? Okay? And so sort of you center group are going to focus on that. And then finally, the third question for the people over there is how do the people behave similarly to your own experiences? Okay, so same 2 questions for everybody, and then 3A, 3B, 3C. Got it? Do you go it?
We used to resort to some pretty creative hacks to take care of our genes.
It got weird.
Luckily, we discovered Tide Pods in Stanley.
So our genes stay in great shape.
And they actually get clean.
What? We can wash them.
Tide Pods plus Downy. Super concentrated to clean, condition, and keep your favorites looking great. It's gotta be Tide.
Okay, so there's your questions. very quick, 2 minutes with your partner near you. Focus on those questions and see what you think. And stop. That was not bad. Not bad. Okay, now I'm going to show you a second video, and they're going to have the same 3 questions, as a matter of fact. Okay, so this is nothing new. So if you remember those 3, that should be good. So here we go.
Oh, the pantry of shame.
Buy one, get 2 free. That's an incredible deal.
Not when we have to do the laundry 3 times to get it clean. So now we stick to Tide. It's the stains out on the first wash. Now all our mistakes are behind us.
Like your cargo shorts?
Like your ex.
Okay, so you have the same 3 questions. So the first 2 I think is going to be pretty simple. Okay, for the last question, I have one little additional task, and that is, once you think about your answer to these questions, A, B, and C, or whichever one you really want to talk about, I also want you to think which one of these 3 questions is the most inclusive as a materials writer, and for the students that are in your class, and maybe you as a teacher, if you identify within this LGBTQ community. Okay, so that's the 3rd, maybe 4th question for you. So again, nice quick little conversation. Thank you very much for your participation. So I'm pretty sure that if we use these 2 videos as a listening task, and these were the questions that we were asking our students, the first 2 would be fairly simple, right? So they're doing laundry in the video, right? That's more or less what's happening. And then the second question is basically to sell Tide, right? So that's largely what it's about. If you answered the first 3A, how do you feel about the people in the video? In the first one, I presume you would probably think, oh, well, they're a little bit crazy. Maybe I haven't seen people do stuff like that in order to dry out their jeans and so on. And so that might be surprising to you. The second question, you might say, well, they used to do some very creative ways to try to dry their jeans, but now they use Tide Pod and everything seems to be a little bit better and easier. The third, I don't know if you would say that I've done some similar things to those first people by putting the jeans on the clothes line or putting them in the freezer or whatever, but maybe you have. The second video, for 3A, it really depends, I think, on who you are and how you're going to answer that question. So how do you feel about the people in the video setting someone up to give an opinion about the characters within that video? Right? How do they surprise you? That's suggesting that something about what they do is different than what you do, and therefore it's surprising. Right? For B, you might say, well, in the past they used to use a different type of laundry detergent that wasn't very good, and in the present they use Tide Pod and it works quite well. Although there might be a couple of variations you might have. and see how do the people behave similarly. You might, again, depending on who you are, answer this question slightly differently. However, some people who are a little bit more unfamiliar with LGBTQI community might say something like, oh, well, they act just the same as I do, right? They do laundry, they're acting like a couple, how wonderful. We have some very interesting similarities, right, between that and I. However, when I am going to choose which of these three is actually the most inclusive, and I'm not going to spotlight anybody, it's really B. B is the most inclusive. And the reason for that is because I think most materials writers, and particularly straight materials writers, tend to think C is probably the most inclusive. And the reason for that is because you're trying to find some similarities, right? However, in finding similarities, you're setting up the idea that the default is the heteronormative, and the special thing is the LGBTQI. And so what that does is it can cause an exclusion to the LGBTQI students in your class, or in my case, me. So I'll let the cat out of the bag. I'm gay. Whereas the second one, in this case, it really just focuses on the language itself. And I'm not saying that all tasks that involve LGBTQI have to only focus on the language. However, in these three choices, what it does do is it removes the uniqueness or specialness of the LGBTQI characters and narratives, and it focuses on something that can transfer across all narratives without focusing on that particular sexuality or setting up a default and not. And so I would regard B as the most inclusive question. And so when I give this type of talk to materials writers in particular, and obviously some teachers as well, many think C is the most inclusive. And I think what that highlights is that we need training on figuring out how to make inclusive materials. And it's not quite as simple as one might think it is. Now, this talk really stems from a few things as to why I'm giving this type of talk these days. One is that we may make assumptions about the demographics of our students in our classes. And it can be very simple, if you're not part of the LGBTQI community, or even if you are, to assume there are none in your classroom. And when you look around, it's very easy to other the LGBTQI by saying them, or that community, and so on. I've done it myself. You know, I grew up in a time in Canada where it was not cool to say that you were part of the LGBTQI community, and everything was heteronormative. I saw only heteronormative characters on television, and if I saw an LGBTQI, it was sort of the brunt of a joke in that type of way. And so even when I traveled to Korea, or later in my career as I started in Canada, I still didn't refer to myself as part of the community. And so I felt I was doing an injustice eventually, because I need to be a model for my students. And so I've radically changed that approach. But one of the reasons for that is simply because when you look at the class, you may just sort of assume that no one is in part of that community. And I'll show you a picture of my own class, and you can see sort of why that might happen. As I said, I've really been thinking about how it is that we may talk about LGBTQIA within our classroom, and the language that we use to talk about us instead of talking about them. Another thing that came up is there was research done where some lesbian and gay students in particular were asked about their experiences in the San Francisco ESL classroom. And they suggested, there were many times that the teacher didn't mean to other than, but they actually did through the language that was occurring. And one example of that was a teacher had said, you know, in a sort of dating or relationships unit, so when do you want to get married? Do you have a boyfriend or girlfriend? And Sako from Japan, who was a lesbian student, said, oh, I do have a girlfriend, actually. She was female as well. And the teacher said, oh, I think you mean boyfriend, right? And it's just something that comes out, you know, and some people don't even realize it's happening because you just sort of think it must be an error, because when you're looking at the class demographic, it may not be so visible. And so we need to be aware of these types of situations with our students. And then finally, which is predominantly what this talk is about, is how do we include LGBTQIA groups in our materials themselves in an appropriate way that does not other. And that can be the sort of most challenging aspect. So what I'm going to be doing throughout this talk, in particular towards the end, is I'm going to show you two sets of materials that I've created. One is a course book unit. Now it's not a real course book unit because real course book units don't have LGBTQI students in them. However, I've mocked up one and I'm going to show you bits and pieces of it. And then I'm also going to show you a set of materials that is not from a course book, but things that we just generally cobble together and try to make a unit out of. And so I'm going to try to show you how those two things can be done inclusively. Now this is my class. This was the class I had last year, and in my class it's completely homogenous. I work at a university. They're all Chinese mainland students who come over to my university in order to study in their undergrad programs. So I don't teach Link, I don't have a diverse crowd, and one of the contributing factors to not recognizing different minority groups within your class might be the fact that they're homogenous, in my case in particular. But what I learned throughout the time that I was with these students is there were 2 LGBTQI students within this group. But which one? Do you know who they are? There was also a student who was from a minority group within China, but of course I didn't know that. I didn't understand really the context. And so the main point here is that you can't always see it, right? You have to assume that there might be a diverse group, even within a homogeneous group like this. Now, one way I think that's important to start off the conversation is to have institutional support for all the different goings-on that might happen with LGBTQIA in your classes. And the University of Toronto, I'm very lucky, and I'm assuming quite a few universities have policies like this, where there are safe spaces. And so seeing these types of signs posted around your classroom and around your institution is very helpful. However, in lieu of that, you may need to create an inclusivity course statement. And this might be something that in the university you put on your course description, but it might be something that you and your students negotiate in your own classrooms if you don't have such a type of syllabus. And so I'm going to show you an example of one before we get to the materials. Now, I think inclusive course statements need to govern all participants. They need to acknowledge that there's differences within the group. If possible, they should state that there is an institutional policy. I think it's important to name specifically what's not tolerated and what is tolerated. And then, of course, what to do when problems arise in the classroom. And so as an example, I'm going to show you mine. Now, it's quite long, and I don't expect you to read it thoroughly, but you kind of get a quick glance at it. Now, I'm going to go through different parts of it just so you have an example. So in the green, I've got areas where it shows that it governs everybody in the classroom, right? So it talks about the student's responsibility, it talks about my responsibility. In the orange, it shows that I realize there are differences within the individuals within that classroom, and we're going to celebrate those differences, right? They're a contributing factor to why our classroom is going to be amazing. In the yellow, I do have the affordance of naming the institutional policies. So again, if there's any problems, I can just say, look, the university has this policy, we have to all abide by it. In the blue, I specifically name the things that will not be tolerated. Racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, socioeconomic differences, ableist differences, ageist differences, and so on. I think these things are important to spell out very clearly to our audience, and it can, bring up a discussion as to what these terms mean, of course. But there it is in black and white, or blue in this case. And then finally in the pink, I have what do we do when you feel as though there's something that's not actually making you feel included. And so we're going to work on these ideas together. So as an example, I do think it's important that we start out our classrooms with this type of framing in mind. long before we ever get to materials themselves. Now, talking about materials, I want to quickly mention what I think is othering and then what I think is inclusion, just so we have a slight definition of terms. Okay, so if we look at our term materials in this sort of way, we can suggest that within your term you may have themes that you're covering, and then within those themes you may have a certain number of classes that you're covering those themes on. So it may be 4, maybe 5, maybe 3, maybe 1 class that you have a theme on. And then within that class, we have all of these different narratives that appear. Now, what happens in an othering situation is if you think about the narratives being color-coded as one type of person is that color, then I think this represents what I call an othering approach. And what we have is we have situations where some people's narratives are just completely missing from the materials. Right? So, as you can see as an example, right here we have purple, 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 right? There's no diversity within those materials, right? And so what's happening is we're othering a group of people by just totally excluding them. We may also be underrepresenting a particular group of people, right? So again, here we've got yellow, there we've got yellow, but yellow doesn't appear anywhere else. And if in our society, yellow makes up some of our society, and we may be underrepresenting them in the materials themselves. We also may separate a particular group into a specialist category altogether, right? And this is what tends to happen a lot of times, I think, in some classrooms, particularly course books that do try to talk about sort of taboo issues, is they lump them all into one group, right? And so we can see all these pink people are being covered in this class, right? And by isolating one group of people and talking about them in one set of materials, in one class, and not all of the other ones, right? We're othering them because what's happening is we're creating them into a sort of special, unique category. And I think this is something that is more common than we think. And then finally, othering is when you spotlight one representative as the general representative for that entire group. So here we can see, there's the yellow person, right? Or there's the pink person. And so what's happening in this case is, yeah, you're including that person, that group into your materials, but you're including one generic version of that group, right? So this pink person is apparently the only type of pink person there is. And so it becomes the sort of one representative, and I think we're losing individualism. Whereas it might be a little difficult to see here, but these purple ones have slightly different shades of colors, right? And so within purple, the majority, you can see individualism, right? But within the other groups, you can only see one sort of color. And so that others that group as well, because you're suggesting that here is the gay character, and they represent gay characters for all gay characters in all time, right? And so that is a type of othering. Now, by contrast, inclusion would look a little bit more like this. And so I think you can see by contrast some differences to the way in which I showed othering. By contrast, all groups are represented appropriately in the context, right? They're not simply one-offs here and there. They're represented by a variety of individualism, right? So we can see that the pink have slightly different colors in some cases. The yellow have slightly different colors, just like the purple did, right? So there's a wide variety of narratives within all sorts of groups of people, not just the one representative. A key thing is we need authentic voices from these groups. And this is where it comes down to materials writers or teachers who are creating materials. It can be very easy to talk about LGBTQI characters, but you may not actually have enough experience with LGBTQI life experience to actually create an authentic voice for an LGBTQI character. And so I feel as though it behooves not only LGBTQI people like myself to consult and to help you determine whether or not this is an authentic version, but also you need to go out and learn yourself about what it means to be LGBTQI and find videos and listen to the voices and include a wide variety of voices as part of the narrative, rather than just sort of writing about it yourself. Individuals are not spotlighted without their consent, right? So again, when you find out that there's an LGBTQI student in your class, it can be very tempting to ask that student for their, advice and authority on quite a few things. But sometimes they don't want that, right? Sometimes we don't want to be spotlighted. And sometimes we think, I'm not an expert in all things gay just because I'm gay, right? And then finally, we want to normalize. Ultimately, we want to have LGBTQI among many narratives, so that it is just a normal thing that our students see throughout the materials. And so let's take a look a little bit about how this might happen. Now, I'm going to really oversimplify two approaches to materials designs, just simply because we're in a plenary and it's a little bit of a condensed version of a course, so to speak. The first approach that I'm going to take a look at is a normalizing approach. Right? And so when I talk about normalizing, I'm really suggesting that the inclusion of LGBTQI is among many narratives and regularly. And as a result, the exposure to LGBTQI is just constantly there. And that can make it seem less special and more just part of our society. The second approach is more something we call disruptive approach. And the disruptive approach is not just putting in LGBTQI characters among many, but actually focusing on the LGBTQI itself. And this one takes a little bit of care. So I'm going to talk about how to do that and how not to do that right now. Now let's take a very common topic of family, which appears in almost every course book everywhere since the beginning of time. And you may see something like this. Now, this might be a little bit outdated, but I think it's not altogether that different, right? We have a bunch of vocabulary, we have some pictures, and what you can see is there's no LGBTQI reference in there at all. So by that, I mean you can't see two dads, two moms, you can't see anything like that among this narrative, right? So not altogether that great. You might also see something like this, or a version of this, where students are to either draw their family, or they're to bring in pictures of their family and talk about their family and so on. I think this is a little bit more inclusive. However, what it is doing is it is kind of spotlighting that student, especially if they don't want to be spotlighted, right? So if I have two dads, I am either going to have to make a choice about drawing my authentic family and then explaining that to everyone, and then becoming the representative of LGBTQI, or I lie. And so this can be problematic as well. Now, let's take a look at sort of a contrasting version of normalization. So here's a slight course book unit, a little bit of a course book unit that I put together. And it starts out this way. So I decided to focus on work-life balance as a unit. And so the way I'm going to start this unit out is with this little quotation to get a little class discussion generated, right? We literally stopped to smell the flowers. Now, keep in mind, the whole unit is going to be about balancing work and life, and so the language that actually is going to be coming out of this is sort of a compare-contrast type of language. Now, in this case, I might start with the students talking about this idiom, stop to smell the flowers, or stop to smell the roses. What does that mean? How do you feel about that? And how is that related to work-life balance? And then we may focus on a particular language, which is literally, and say, okay, well, how does literally be exemplified by this picture? How does it contrast with the meaning of stop to smell the flowers in terms of the idiom itself? So that might just start off a little bit of discussion. And this picture is going to come up later. This is my dog, as a matter of fact. Now, the next part of this unit is to listen to some people talk about their experiences with work and life. And so a very common listening task, listen to these people describe their experiences with work and life. And so as they listen to the audio, they're going to hear from these different groups of people talk about what pressures do they face in life and what makes them happy in life. And then the student has an opportunity to talk about or think about, well, how about you? Do you relate to some of the things that these people are saying? So they would be listening to all of these 8 different groups of people, and from this point, really, it's a little difficult to tell who's who, right? But they'll listen to audio that kind of looks like this. And so I have interviewed some people and created an audio, but I don't have the audio right here itself, so I'm just going to let you take a quick look at the types of things these people say. So here's Christy and George, or Jorge, and Christy is the one that's speaking. So what you can see in this case is, as the students starting to fill out the chart, they're putting about what type of pressure to the character's face. So, you know, the baby's here, right? She's very tired, and so on. What makes her happy, right? How does she balance that? Well, Jorge's been making dinner every night. She can't stand for too long, so they're going to be filling out this chart. And maybe some of the students would identify with something that's going on here. Then they'll listen to the next one. And this is an example of what these 2 characters might say, Jen in particular. Now again, what you can imagine is the students listening to this, to Jen talk, and they're filling out that chart that you saw earlier. Here's Mum, that's how she wanted to be referred to, and Sam, and Mum is talking. So again, we can start to see the pattern that's emerging in terms of the chart filling out, right? It's about work, life, and balance. We can see some things that cause people a little bit of trouble and pressure. We can see some things that make people happy. And then here's Levi, the lone person who doesn't have a partner in this conversation. Now what I hope you notice throughout this is that the pronouns that are being used throughout reveal, in fact, that there are LGBTQIA characters in this narrative, but they're not highlighted, right? It's not like you're drawing attention to these characters and saying, okay, now we're going to listen to 2 lesbians talk, right? But what we can see is that they're integrated within the narrative, and this is a normalizing approach. Right? And so this is the sort of baby step 1 into including LGBTQI into materials. It's not highlighted, it's not made special, it's just integrated throughout the audio. And there, of course there's 4 other groups. And so the students are focusing on the task at hand as opposed to necessarily the LGBTQI-ness of the characters that are involved. And so ultimately I'm teaching the language of compare and contrast. Right? And so this is the language that actually might emerge as part of the language focus of this lesson, and the collocations and the grammatical impacts of these types of words, and the productive tasks and so on would probably spill out from there. But ultimately, throughout the narratives, I'm including LGBTQI, and a variety as well. Right? We can see finally there's someone here that actually doesn't want to get married at all, and I think that's important to represent too. In the second part, they would see these pictures, right? So after doing that task, and we can see A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and these are the characters that were actually part of that listening task. And so what the characters would then be doing, or the students, I'm sorry, would first be that the families you listen to are at different stages of life, so order them, right? How do you feel that they're ordered in terms of who comes first in their sort of life plan, right? So we can see that someone may say, oh, well, maybe this group is first, right? Because they just seem to be a dating couple. They don't have any children at this point. They may then think that, okay, this is probably the second group of people in life, right? Because they're pregnant, but not at the hospital just yet, right? and so on, maybe, and then so on. Oh no, maybe he's first, and then them, and then them. And then this one's sort of the random one that doesn't include any babies at all. Then I would ask the students in this course book to use your notes from the chart to explain their work-life balance and use the compare and contrast language that we've been learning, right? So they're going to identify that these characters are the ones that were in the audio transcript. In the audio transcript, you didn't maybe notice so much that the LGBTQI was there. In the pictures, it's a little bit more in your face because you can actually see these characters there. But again, we're not focusing on the LGBTQ-ness of them. We're focusing on the language tasks that any course book would be doing. Now, a second part of this course book unit might look a little bit like this. I'm going to be slightly more disruptive, but not too much, right? So instead of having just a straight couple holding hands, I've got a gay couple. And I listened to John Gray, his plenary at ITEFL, and of course, he was suggesting maybe you don't always want to use the perfectly handsome, couple. But, I thought about changing it, and then I thought, well, hey, look at them. I'm sorry, but in this case, I want to include them because I'm quite attracted to them, frankly. But we have the same sort of beginning, right? Home isn't where the heart is for us, right? So in the second part of this unit, we can see we're starting out with another type of idiom, but again, it's contrasting how that idiom is normally used, right? Same as we did in the first section. And then I've got an area where the students are going to talk about, or do a little bit of reading about these four groups of people. And so people do many things to help them relax. How do you think these people in the images manage their work-life balance? And so I'll have students try to talk about, okay, what it is that these people do that does, in fact, manage their work-life balance. And then just like sort of a typical course book, you're going to go read what actually these people do. So partner A is going to go to page 55 and read about some of them. Partner B is going to go to page 57 and read about other ones. And then they're going to come back together and talk about what these characters actually do to manage their work-life balance. And the surprising fact here is that these things look as though is what they're doing to manage their work-life balance is the good thing, but actually, when you read through them, all of these situations are the things that stress them out. And so that's what they're going to be talking about as sort of the surprise aspect. Now, I want to take a look at something that's a little bit more disruptive, because that is something that materials writers and teachers do tend to try to do, and sometimes not so successfully. So the first way was normalizing, where we're integrating LGBTQI characters seamlessly within a course book unit or your own materials without actually focusing on that aspect. Disruptive is a slightly more in-your-face approach. And I think disruptive works in some ways because you don't always want to present every group of people as the most heteronormative version of those people, right? So the fact that we're in minority groups causes a lot of problems for us. And so we shouldn't ignore that aspect of society either. We shouldn't always try to gloss over it and say, everybody's just like everybody else. It's not always true, right? So this time we're going to be doing a little bit of flat out, here's some gay people and let's see what comes out of it. However, there are bad ways to do this. This is one. Now, what I hate about this, first of all, is you're being asked to just sort of brainstorm some ideas that you associate with these types of topics, right? And what's your first word reaction to the word gay? Lesbian, homosexual. What do you think is going to come out of that, right? You're setting the students up to say something, right? So not so great. Debates also, in my opinion, a terrible thing. I hate debates, particularly with human rights issues. Because they're not debatable, right? And if you suggest that they are debatable, you, a teacher, are in a power position. And by bringing that into the classroom, you're saying to the students, it's okay for you to take this side or that side because they're both perfectly valid sides. And that's not always the case. And so here we can see marriage should be between a man and a woman versus that's an old way of thinking, right? Only God can decide who can get married, blah, 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 blah. This gay marriage one was a very hot topic and something that people love to use for debates at one point or other, and maybe still do. I mean, this is still on the internet. But what it does is it on one hand, is disruptive because you're actually talking about the LGBTQ-ness. But on the other hand, you're forcing the students to take a side about my rights, and that's just not okay. And because it's a power position that I have with the students, you may think you're being neutral by staying out of it, but you're not being neutral at all because you're the one who brought this up as a topic. So I think we have to be very careful about debating when it comes to human rights. Now, it even gets worse. Now, the author of these materials was well-intentioned. It wasn't like the author of these materials set out to say negative things about gay people. They just didn't really think it through. And some of the other materials are actually pretty good on his website. However, this is just something that happens. If you're not trained and you don't think it through, these are the types of disruptive approaches that end up coming out sometimes. I don't know, how do you feel about gay bashing? Should it be allowed? Now, let's take a look at something a little bit perhaps more appropriate. Now, here's a picture of a typical family. And I don't think it's wrong to use a picture of this, but I think there's a way to use it. So I might ask the students a question like this. How do you react to this representation of a family? See what comes out, right? Can they, in fact, highlight any problem areas with this representation or not? Right? What struggles might they face in society? Is there something that they would suggest that this particular family has a problem in society? Maybe they will say, no, they look perfectly happy. Everything's wonderful. They've got blue eyes and blonde hair. Everything's great, you know? Maybe, maybe not. But what I'm doing with these questions is I'm setting them up to start critically thinking about the images that they're being exposed to. What types of families exist outside of this view? So here, again, I'm trying to force the students to think more critically about this image that they're exposed to in course books and materials and advertising and everything all over the place. And see if we can get the students to really and elicit ideas from them about who is missing, who is not represented from this group. And what they may hopefully recognize is that they themselves are not in this, right? And so they're not being represented. And I think that's a very valuable thing to highlight to the students when you're starting to include LGBTQI narratives, is the connection between their experiences and other minority groups, such as the LGBTQI. So from this, I might move on to something a little bit more solid and in your face. So this is an Instagram profile of these two men who are raising two daughters. And what we can see from this is they are not the most clean-cut versions of gay men out there. But they're real people, and this is a version of their life. And so I feel as though we need to represent not only one type of gay man or lesbian or transgender or whichever community member you're talking about, but a wider variety that's somewhat more realistic. Now, of course, you can see that they're talking about the challenges of raising two daughters and so on. So I might have the students think and talk about, okay, what's going on in here? But to guide them a little bit, I might also ask them, how do these fathers represent themselves in this Instagram post? Why do you think they represent themselves that way? Again, trying to elicit some critical thinking here. Are these fathers simply writing this because it's the absolute truth only? Or is there another reason why these fathers may in fact be posting Instagram posts like this? Such as the fact that we may need to think about what types of challenges they face in society that are different sort of than the heteronormative group. But maybe they're trying to appeal to a different audience and show the similarities, and they're framing their life in a certain way to show that they're very similar to everybody else. And that might be something that comes out from this type of material. Oops, I'm getting too far away. Another question we might talk about with students is, why do we see less of these types of people in materials, education materials, but it could be advertising, it could be anything, right? So why is it that we see that first type of image more often than we see that second type of image? What are the factors involved that are going to cause society not to be using these types of images? And so in this disruptive approach, what we're not doing is debating whether or not two men should have daughters. We're not debating whether or not, or talking about how they feel about these two men being together and adopting. We're not talking about necessarily whether there should be interracial couples and things like that. What we're focusing on is the critical pedagogy behind it, right? So why is it that we see this differently? Why do we get exposed to the type of image that we see in the first round? Moving on, here's another quick set of materials that I'll show for you. And I know I have 18 seconds left, but I'm going to go on just a little bit. So here I've got two images from this really brilliant website called Two Kinds of People. And you need to decide if you're an A person or a B person. Okay, so we can show students these types of images and have them think, okay, are you an A person or are you a B person? Right? Or, are you an A person? Chat is off all the time. Or are you a B person, where chat is available all the time? Are you an A person, or are you a B person? And finally, are you an A person, or are you a B person? Now, what you might be thinking of is, okay, well, what is this about, right? And so, I'm trying to get the students to think about where else do you see this type of either-or situation, right? You're either this or you're that. And is that actually a valid feeling? Like, can we actually say that you're always an A person or you're always a B person, right? So I'm trying to get the students to recognize that there isn't always that one or the other. Right? Perhaps they might see this. Are you an A person? Or are you a B person? Right? Very similarly, we're getting this idea come out that society is broken into dichotomies, false dichotomies, where you're one or the other. And is that actually true? Many of the students in the A, B from before might recognize, well, sometimes I do this one and sometimes I do that one. I'm not always an A person or always a B person. Right? And so when we start to bring up images that we see in society where there is this dichotomy, it leads into the recognition that it's not always just one or the other. Are you an A person? Or are you a B person? And how well does that represent you? Maybe you can see where this is going, right? Again, I'm trying to highlight to the students that it's not always about sexuality, right? Men, are you a football person? And women, are you a shopping person? No, it's not always that way, right? These are these false dichotomies. And do you actually see yourself in these areas of society? And how do you feel about them? Right? So I might ask the students, how do you react to these signs? Here's another bathroom sign. Okay? Do men need to be the Batman? Do women need to be the Wonder Woman? Right? Is this something that is absolutely true? I can ask the students, okay, what do you think? Is there a benefit to signs like these? Right? I want to be a balanced person. I don't want to just lead to my gay agenda. And so maybe I'll get some ideas out from them about how these are useful signs. But again, we can then talk also, how might they be problematic? In what ways do you not see yourselves in these signs? How is it that this is promoting a certain gender stereotype, as an example? What solution might you find to this? And see what the students can come up with. And of course, in these lessons, I'm not showing you a particular language point, right? Because these materials can be used whatever language point or grammatical point that it is that you're talking about. But then we might move on to something more about bathrooms, right? Since that's what we're on. I saw this recently at an airport, and we have a family, an all-gender bathroom. And we can get the students to start thinking about, okay, is this a solution to this problem? Right? Or is there also some problematic situation with this type of bathroom? And I would argue probably at some point we may see there is a slight problematic situation here, because there's this bathroom and then there's a male and female bathroom actually as well. And so just by having this bathroom here, you know, one problematic thing that might arise is you're still kind of othering, right? You're still saying you have to go over here, right? If you're not male or female and so on. This is at my own university. It was a campaign that was about the washrooms at the university. And we saw these types of signs that said, we might not be the most visible, but we're here, we can make this space our own. More specifically towards the bathrooms, where if you're questioning the gender of someone in the washroom, don't. They know better than you, they should be here. And so the idea in this type of campaign throughout my university was, with regards to transgender people, if they go into the washroom and you think that they're not visibly female or male, you should just let it go, because they know whether they should be here or not, right? They know which bathroom they identify with. But again, I think a discussion can emerge as to how does this benefit society, but also what problematic areas might come out of it. And so we're not talking about whether LGBTQIA is good or bad, what their human rights are, but we're focusing on the LGBTQIA-ness as part of the lesson. And this is more of the disruptive approach as opposed to just simply normalizing. And so I think we can go from normalization as step one into disruptive types of materials in step two. But we need to have some training. We need to learn how to do this appropriately. And because if we don't, we're going to end up with that sort of disruptive approach that isn't so great that we saw kind of at the beginning. So again, we may ask the students, do these solutions create any problems? And how can we be inclusive and safe for everyone? And so perhaps the students then can be tasked with generating a solution to the idea of the washroom situation, right? If this is problematic, or this is problematic in some way, okay, great, fine. Let's figure out a way to make it more inclusive for everyone, and have the students tasked with doing something like that. And so these are two examples of how I feel a disruptive approach may be more appropriate in our LGBTQI narratives than, say, a way that we might be othering those LGBTQI unintentionally. So I'm going to end with a few key takeaways. Hopefully you've gleaned some of these already from this talk. And we'll see if that's true. The first of which is some include ideas. Okay, so the first is, I believe we need to include representation among the many narratives within our materials with some regularity. Okay, so we need to see LGBTQI throughout our materials on a constant basis, not just in this unit and then we're done. We need to include and consult voices from within the community where possible when we're making our own materials. And so I heard yesterday from Shelley, or maybe a couple of days ago from Shelley Johnson, that Indigenous people make up 2% of the population in the universities, and therefore they can't do it on their own. And I would say very similarly, we can't do this by ourselves either, right? And I feel as though what's going to happen is I'm going to get a whole bunch of emails after today saying, hey, can you look at my materials? Because you're the LGBTQI I know, and that would be great. But I actually just don't have enough time to do that. So for some, yes, maybe. But really, we need to not only consult LGBTQI when we're making materials to see if we're doing it in an appropriate and inclusive manner, but you really do need to start informing yourself right? And take training workshops on how to do this yourself. Go watch videos. Do whatever you can to hear authentic LGBTQI voices so that you can represent us well in your materials too. Include activities that don't force your learners to speak for or make decisions about LGBTQI groups. And this is a big one. This comes down to that debate situation, right? Someone in your class may come in with a perfectly open mind about LGBTQI, or they may be LGBTQIA themselves, and you're telling them, okay, I want you to argue against it, right? That would obviously not be a good decision. Always remember this phrase that I heard from an Indigenous scholar was, not about us, without us. Create tasks that can transfer across narratives, right? So like we saw that at the beginning with those two videos, right? Some questions are more appropriate maybe for one sort of heteronormative situation, and some are less appropriate for an LGBTQI. So putting some thought into that as to how can we ask the same questions of both sides of the group is something to consider. And then finally, I would just caution you with the disruptive approach, right? So take care with disruptive inclusion to include LGBTQIness without our rights being the discussion itself, right? And that can be a little challenging, and I think this is where the training is ultimately going to need to take place. So as I end, I will leave you with one final call to action. We can't wait for traditional publishers to give us these materials. Traditional publishers that may be in the exhibitor room or at any conference, they're not going to do this for us right now. They may in time, and I hope they do, but they're not going to do it right now. I think independent publishing is currently the way to go. And so with that in mind, and to be part of this community, I'm going to put all of my sample course book unit and the materials that I just showed you on my blog after I get back to Toronto. And it'll be free and open, and you can take it and use it however you want, or use it as a model for other things in your own classroom. And I would encourage you to do the same with some other materials that are emerging from this conference, such as Rowan and Kate's materials. And I think you should really go to their workshop. Finally, this is a good course book you might want to check out. It's recently released by two friends of mine, James Taylor and Eli Coimbra from Brazil. And they've just, it's freely, I don't think it's freely available. You have to pay a little bit, but it goes to a charity. All the profits go to it. So with that in mind, I'm going to say thank you very much. And if you want to know when those materials are available, you can go and put your email address there, and I will send you a link to it in case you don't see my blog. Thank you very much.